Well, let's dive into the questions. I'm going to go first to Nikki, who asks, given Parliament has only just come back from their summer holidays, I hear you, Nikki, why are they breaking up again for their party conferences? Is this not just a massive waste of their and our time?
By and large, party conferences are not. They're really, really important. There is the Labour Party. There's a kind of big Labour family, all those people, who work for the Labour Party locally and who look forward to conference as a time when they can meet members of in this case, the cabinet, thank goodness, and mingle with each other. And I think it's really, really important for ministers as well to realise they don't just exist in a vacuum. They are part of a movement of people with the values and, there's been a lot of sort of criticism of typical Labour people being very, very left-wing or very this or very that. I've been going to conference for 40 years and I'm always struck by the sort of middle-of-the-road, common sense, a balanced nature of most of the people around me. These are the normal people of Britain. And I think it's very, very important that ministers come out from Whitehall, come out from their bunkers and meet them face to face.
Are they, though? I mean, no disrespect to the people who attend party conferences, but generally, en masse, the general public really, they're not going to pay attention, are they? I mean, the people that attend are those who are most politically engaged, who are perhaps party members.
So I was arguing that it's important because it's where the leadership of a party meets the rest of the party. And I think that does have to happen once a year. But in terms of facing the general public, the leader's speech at the party conference is one of the very, very few moments in a year when a party leader, in this case the Prime Minister, can make a big argument and have some hope of reaching people watching the evening news, listening to the morning radio programmes and so on. It is a big moment and it has to land right. I've been looking at the last two occasions when a Labour leader, after a long period of the Tories in power, came to a conference as the relatively new Prime Minister. That's Harold Wilson in 1964 and Tony Blair in 1997, in both cases in Brighton. And if you look at their speeches, they really mattered. People noticed them, the press noticed them, the media noticed them, and they set the course for the year ahead.
I think party conferences are important exercises in internal democracy. There are votes at a Labour Party conference. It's not just a rally in the manner of US party conferences or the Conservative Party. You do sometimes see the leadership defeated on key issues, but they're also important acts of external democracy because it's really the time when a party's policies, leadership strategy are stress tested by the media and by party members and activists, not just on the Labour side, but let's think of the Conservative conference under Liz Truss, for instance, when the revolt against the cut in the top rate of tax, led by Michael Gove, really came to a head and was, I think, an important moment in seeing that she wasn't going to be able to continue as Prime Minister. Now, I just don't think things would come to a head quite as fast if you didn't have these occasions where all of the people who matter in the party and all of the key journalists are in one city together for the best part of a week.
Good for democracy, then.
Well, if this podcast is going to be based on a ferocious disagreement between George and Andrew, it's not going to work, because I also agree with all of that.
Oh, come on, gentlemen.
I think, and in particular this year, we've had these series of stories, we'll come on to them, I'm sure, about sort of freebies and clothes and all the rest of it, and the cut in the winter fuel allowance for pensioners. And those are stories which would, in the normal circumstances of things, they'd bob along in the media, they'd affect the polls, and they'd go away again. I think the party conference means that the conjunction of those kind of stories is going to be very, very difficult for Keir Starmer in a good way. I mean, I think he really has to address those issues in front of people genuinely concerned and worried about them, and that's going to have an effect.
You're right. We are going to come on to those in a short period of time. I mean, I think it's worth reflecting, isn't it, that actually there might be a really positive atmosphere at the conference because we've got 200 completely new Labour MPs who've all been finding their coat pegs and locker keys in Parliament over the last couple of months. And it's really interesting. Our colleague Megan Kenyon's been talking to one of those, Georgia Gould, who is also Parliamentary Secretary at the Cabinet Office. And she was telling Megan what she hoped this Labour conference would achieve.
I think this Labour Party conference is a real opportunity for the Labour Party to talk to the country about the missions. There's been a huge amount of work going on. The King's speech set out a really ambitious agenda to meet those missions, but it's not something that government can do alone. We need to work with civil society, to work with the private sector, to work with communities, and we want these missions to be something that everybody feels that they are part of. So I think that the conference is a place that we can really show the opportunity of this long-term approach.
Andrew, Georgia speaking really quite optimistically there about Labour being able to set out a long-term vision at this conference, and a positive one. And that's something that you have been very critical of about them. But we're turning a corner, and it's our front cover this week, in fact. You're asking, what's the story?
What's the story? And they really can't leave Liverpool, third year in Liverpool, by the way. They can't leave Liverpool this year without having answered that question, in my view. Now, Georgia Gould there, of course, the daughter of Philip Gould, who was so important back in 1997, one of those earlier conferences I mentioned. And I think there is a story to tell. I think I know the answer to what's the story. And the answer goes something like...
Not Morning Glory.
It's not Morning Glory. Beatles tribute band.
Discuss.
Anyway.
We might actually get some disagreement between you guys. Anyway, sorry.
Yes, I think there is a story here. I think Rachel Reeves is absolutely right that growth is incredibly important for this country. Years and years and years of anemic growth, terrible productivity, doesn't just mean that people are poorer. It doesn't mean that family budgets are tighter. It also means the country is unhappier, angrier, more divided. I think a lot of the trouble about immigration and a lot of the community trouble is really about the lack of growth and people feeling that the future isn't opening out in an optimistic way for them and their children as it should. And I think, therefore, they have to make growth a kind of flesh and blood emotional subject, not just a dryly economic one. And also they have to attach every single policy, everything they say has to be part of their growth agenda. And again, it has to be growth for a purpose, not just growth as growth. That's a dry and meaningless thing. And it's been said to me by somebody who knows him very well that what Keir Starmer said when he was responding to the Grenfell Tower report about the need for much greater respect for marginalised communities and people in this country and a general social rebalancing is exactly where he wants to be. Now, that is a very, very traditional Labour message. And I think and I hope that that's going to be the pith of his speech.
How important is it that Labour do sell this positive message, George?
It's incredibly important because, as Andrew said, look, the party conference is the biggest opportunity that the governing party gets each year to set out its message, with the exception perhaps of the budget. And they haven't had the best start. I think that there are two interesting trends here. One is there's been a huge amount of policy activity. Look, sometimes a prime minister comes to power, Gordon Brown, Theresa May, Boris Johnson. So criticism is, what are they for? Where is the policy agenda? The cupboard feels a bit bare. There's been a huge amount of activity on numerous fronts. The launch of GB Energy, biggest programme workers' rights for decades, settling the public sector pay disputes, National Wealth Fund, planning reform. But I think they're struggling at the moment to tie it all together into a positive story. And the void is being filled by rows over cronyism, rows over donations, the winter fuel payment cuts, which I think have complicated Labour's message on the economy. Keir Starmer needs to use his conference speech as an opportunity to reset the narrative around the government.
Well, you mentioned cronyism. No doubt that will be rumbling on in the background in Liverpool. And we've got a question from Clive on this matter. He asks, perhaps tongue-in-cheek, how much of the conference is funded by Lord Ali? What's he getting at here, Andrew?
Well, Lord Ali is, of course, the very generous Labour donor who, it turns out, has been offering lots of free stuff to the Starmers. Free clothes to Victoria Starmer and free glasses and free clothes also to Keir Starmer, and who got, albeit briefly, a pass into number 10 Downing Street. Now, there is no evidence whatever that he's actually asked for anything for himself. I don't think this is an access scandal in that sense. I don't think he's got a company that's trying to get, health clothing or anything like that. But it's not a good look. And it's particularly not a good look at a time when you're cutting money for the poorest pensioners, and I think we're going to hear an awful lot about that. Keir Starmer has a huge majority, but this is about his huge or otherwise authority. It's a matter of personal authority. He has to look people in the eye and tick them off and sack them for bad behaviour. He has to impose his own, as it were, personal morality on the party, and this is not helpful.
And very difficult when so many people in the country are struggling to make the argument that someone on that kind of salary, a six-figure salary, can't afford to buy their own clothes. I mean, allied with the clothing, The Guardian splashed earlier this week that Keir Starmer has received £100,000 worth of tickets and gifts, and that, they say, is more than any other recent party leader. I mean, as a Spurs fan, I have no idea why he wants to see Arsenal so much. But George, does this story matter?
I think it matters politically for two reasons. The first is the accusation of hypocrisy, always a deadly charge in politics when a leader's actions appear to be at odds with their image. Keir Starmer in opposition assailed Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak over their financial affairs. They made much recently the government of sort of cancelling a VIP helicopter contract, Sunak's private jet trips, and that's all good and well, but it then does mean that your financial affairs are going to be under greater scrutiny. The line from Number 10 is that the Conservatives were doing all of this in office and we didn't criticise them. But the whole point is that Keir Starmer created an expectation that Labour would be held to a different standard. Now, as Andrew points out, there's no suggestion that any rules were broken. There's no suggestion that there's any corruption or that donors sought or received any political favours, but it's the perception that matters in politics. The second problem is austerity on winter fuel cuts. When you're taking money away from people, you're always going to make yourself vulnerable to the charge that the government's living the high life. I mean, Sky News' Kay Burley put this very brutally to Immigration Minister Angela Eagles when she said, you're taking £300 off pensioners and Keir Starmer's got £76,000 of freebies, now £100,000. So this is a political problem. No one says politics is easy, but it's all about seeing these stories coming.
And Angela Eagle actually really struggled to defend the Prime Minister, didn't she, across the broadcast round?
I didn't think she struggled very hard, but yes, you're right. It was difficult for her, and it's going to be difficult for other ministers. And it's such an easy question to ask. They're going to be asked again and again. We were talking earlier about the big picture, and the danger for Labour is lots of small negative pictures come together so that nobody can actually see the big picture. They're only seeing the little ones.
What's the risk, do you think, Andrew, of this dominating and, overshadowing this positive message that we're hoping to hear over the next few days in Liverpool?
I think probably on the back of that big election victory, the party will come together and we won't hear quite as much of this from the platform. This will absolutely delight the anti-Starmer left. It's complete manna from heaven for them. And there's going to be a lot of people touring the broadcasting studios, trying their very best to smear tar on the wound.
I want to turn to another story which is not playing out too well for Labour, George, and this is the salary of Sue Gray, which was revealed yesterday to be higher than the Prime Minister's, £170,000, so £3,000 more. More than any cabinet minister or indeed her Conservative predecessor. What picture is that painting of this Labour government?
Well, I think,
given it was briefed by her Labour colleagues.
This, I think, is principally a story about internal discontent.
Yeah.
Although, because on the one hand, it's sort of confusing. On the one hand, people are saying Starmer's got this lavish lifestyle. Now we find out he's actually paid less than his chief of staff. And of course, there's a long-running debate over whether prime ministers are underpaid in this country. But here's the context and why it's so incendiary in Labour circles. As I reported back in August, special advisors have been unionising over discontent over their pay and conditions. They found out not just that they were going to be paid less than they were in opposition, but in some cases less than their Conservative predecessors. Into this febrile environment comes the news that Sue Gray is paid more than any advisor in history, £170,000. And I should say the government pushed back and said the BBC's claim that Sue Gray was advised not to take higher pay than the Prime Minister and chose not to was wrong, that her salary, they say, was set, presumably by Keir Starmer, who signed off on that. But I think the process is less important than the reality, which is that an increasingly dysfunctional government where you're having vituperative briefings. There was a senior Labour source who said yesterday to the Sunday Times' Gabriel Pogrund, Sue Gray is the only pensioner better off under Labour. You've got special advisors who are refusing to sign their contracts, and a government that's been in office for 2 months and seems at war with itself. The word that MPs from all wings of Labour use is unsustainable. They think someone needs to get a real grip in Number 10. One Number 10 insider said someone needs to hit the panic button. The question increasingly is, who is that person?
Andrew, it's very early, isn't it, to be seeing this kind of infighting?
Very, very slightly disagree with George.
Go on.
I don't think it's unsustainable, and I think it is being overdone.
Okay.
Just a couple of factoids. The Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case, is, of course, paid more than Sue Gray. And I'm told that if you look pro rata at Nick Timothy and Fiona Hill when they were doing the same sort of job for Theresa May, they were paid more, in fact, than Sue Gray is being paid at the moment. So it's not outlandish in terms of those very, very important jobs. I think what's going on is there's an enormous amount of jealousy and envy. George was saying someone needs to take a grip. I suspect Sue Gray is taking a grip and has got a grip, and that's the problem. There are too many well-paid men, but not quite as well paid as her, but relatively well-paid men on the wrong side of Sue Gray's closed door, and they're really, really angry. And I think Keir Starmer has to back her, and probably back her publicly, and explain that she's very important to him. If you talk to cabinet ministers, they will almost all say that Sue Gray's been a very good thing, that she has got them into the room at a time when other people wouldn't have done, and she's much more attuned to the importance of elected politicians being part of the conversation, and perhaps less than special advisors and the unelected. And I think that's the source of the trouble.